She realized later that what unsettled her most was not the discovery itself, but how naturally it fit into everything she had been quietly ignoring for years, because the signs had always been there in small, forgettable moments, in conversations that ended too quickly, in explanations that sounded reasonable but never felt complete. And for a long time, she told herself that discomfort was simply part of adulthood, something everyone learned to live with. Yet, as she sat alone replaying ordinary memories that suddenly carried different weight, she understood that familiarity had disguised truth, and that trust, once fractured, does not collapse loudly but thins slowly until one day it no longer supports the story you've been standing on. And while she did not feel anger or betrayal in the dramatic sense, there was a deep, steady sadness in realizing how much energy she had spent maintaining stability instead of listening to herself. And this awareness did not demand immediate action or confrontation, it only asked for honesty, an honesty that felt heavier than silence because it could no longer be undone. And as she allowed that honesty to settle, she noticed a subtle shift inside her, not toward certainty or resolution, but toward clarity, the kind that doesn't shout or accuse, but simply stays. And in that clarity, she recognized that moving forward would not be about fixing the past or forcing answers from others, but about choosing not to abandon her own perception anymore. Because once she acknowledged what she knew, even quietly, the illusion of not knowing was no longer available. And from that moment on, her life, whether it changed outwardly or not, would never feel the same again.
She did not tell anyone what she had begun to notice, not because she was afraid of reactions, but because naming it too early felt like giving it a shape she was not yet ready to live with. And instead, she carried the awareness quietly through her days, observing how easily routines continued even as her internal alignment shifted, how laughter still appeared on cue, how conversations followed familiar paths, and how people around her assumed continuity meant certainty, when in reality it only meant habit. And during these days, she became more attentive to herself than she had ever been before, noticing the subtle tension in her body when certain topics arose, the way her thoughts paused before agreeing to things she once accepted automatically. And this attentiveness did not bring relief, but it brought precision, a clearer understanding of where she ended and where expectations had quietly taken over. And as she reflected on the years behind her, she saw how often she had confused being understanding with being absent from herself, believing that patience required silence and that loyalty meant minimizing her own discomfort. Yet now, without anger or urgency, she could see how those beliefs had slowly narrowed her world. And this realization did not push her toward immediate change or dramatic decisions. It only asked her to stay present with what was true, even when that truth felt inconvenient or incomplete. And as she allowed herself to remain in that space, resisting the urge to resolve or justify it, she sensed a different kind of strength forming, not the kind that demands action, but the kind that comes from no longer negotiating with reality. And she understood that whatever came next would have to grow from this steadiness, because returning to unawareness was no longer possible, and moving forward without integrity was no longer an option. As the days passed, she began to notice how silence no longer frightened her the way it once had, because it was within that silence that her thoughts finally had room to breathe. And instead of filling every pause with productivity or reassurance, she allowed herself to sit with uncertainty without trying to soften it. And this choice revealed patterns she had never fully questioned before. How often she had rushed to be understood, how deeply she had feared being misinterpreted, and how much energy she had spent managing the emotional climate around her, believing that stability depended on her vigilance. Yet now she could sense that true stability required something else entirely, a willingness to let others experience their own discomfort without immediately stepping in to resolve it. And as she practiced this restraint, relationships subtly shifted, some growing quieter, others more distant, but a few becoming unexpectedly honest.
And through these changes, she realized that connection built on self-erasure could never feel safe, no matter how familiar it appeared. And while moments of doubt still surfaced, she no longer treated them as warnings to retreat, but as signals inviting deeper self-trust. And with that trust came a growing confidence that her worth was not dependent on consistency or predictability, but on her capacity to remain present with herself, even as circumstances evolved. And though she could not yet name what this new chapter would demand of her, she understood that returning to who she had been before this awareness was no longer possible, because once a life is seen clearly, it cannot be lived blindly again. There were moments when the weight of change felt heavier than the years of quiet endurance she had known before, because transformation did not arrive as relief but as responsibility, demanding that she now act in alignment with what she could no longer deny. And this responsibility showed up in small, uncomfortable choices, in pauses before agreeing, in honest answers she once would have softened, and in boundaries that felt unnatural simply because they were new. And as she navigated these moments, she became aware of how deeply she had been conditioned to equate harmony with self-sacrifice, believing that being needed was the same as being valued. Yet the more she stepped back from this belief, the clearer it became that true intimacy could not survive without mutual recognition. And although some relationships resisted this shift, responding with confusion or subtle withdrawal, she did not rush to repair what was no longer aligned, choosing instead to observe without judgment. And in doing so, she discovered a steadiness within herself that did not rely on external reassurance, a steadiness built slowly through repetition, through choosing truth even when it created distance. And while this process was neither dramatic nor immediate, it reshaped her inner landscape in lasting ways, teaching her that growth was less about becoming someone new and more about releasing the habits that had kept her small. And as she continued forward, uncertain yet grounded, she understood that this path would not guarantee comfort or approval, but it would allow her to live without the quiet exhaustion of pretending. And that, for the first time, felt like a form of freedom she could sustain. As time passed, she began to notice how silence itself had changed its meaning, because it was no longer something she used to avoid conflict or protect others from discomfort, but a deliberate space where she allowed her thoughts to settle before responding. And in this space, she could feel the difference between fear and intuition, between habits formed by years of accommodation and choices rooted in genuine self-respect. And although this awareness did not eliminate doubt, it transformed it into something manageable, something she could sit with rather than escape from. And as she reflected on her past, she saw how often she had rushed to explain herself, believing clarity required constant justification. Yet now she understood that not every truth needed to be defended to remain valid. And this realization softened her internal urgency, allowing her to move through conversations and decisions with greater calm, even when outcomes were uncertain. And while some people struggled to adjust to this quieter version of her, interpreting it as distance or withdrawal, she recognized that what they sensed was not absence but autonomy. And with this autonomy came a deeper sense of alignment, a feeling that her actions, words, and inner values were no longer in conflict. And although this alignment did not promise ease or universal understanding, it offered something far more sustaining, the ability to live without fragmenting herself to meet expectations. And as she continued forward, she accepted that growth would remain uneven and imperfect, but she trusted that each conscious choice strengthened a foundation she had spent a lifetime neglecting. And in that trust, she found a resilience that did not depend on approval, explanation, or control, only on her willingness to remain present and honest with herself. Gradually, she began to understand that healing was not a single realization, but a series of quiet recalibrations, moments where she chose awareness over reaction and patience over the familiar urge to rush toward certainty. And in these moments, she noticed how deeply her earlier life had been shaped by the need to be needed, by the belief that her value was measured through endurance rather than authenticity. Yet, as she examined this belief without judgment, it started to loosen its grip, revealing how much of her exhaustion had come not from hardship itself, but from carrying expectations that were never truly hers. And while this recognition brought a sense of grief for the years spent misunderstanding herself, it also carried relief because it meant the future did not have to follow the same script. And as she practiced responding instead of explaining, listening instead of defending, she discovered that her presence alone was sufficient, that she did not need to perform clarity or emotional strength for others to feel grounded within herself. And although some relationships shifted as a result, becoming quieter or more distant, she accepted this as a natural consequence of change rather than a failure, understanding that connection built on constant self-erasure could never evolve into mutual respect. And with this understanding came a steadier confidence, not loud or insistent, but rooted in the knowledge that she could trust her internal signals even when external validation was absent. And as she moved forward with this trust, she felt less urgency to resolve every tension or define every feeling, allowing ambiguity to exist without anxiety, because she had learned that certainty was not required to live meaningfully, only honesty. And in embracing this honesty, she began to experience a calm strength that did not seek control or reassurance, but rested quietly in the acceptance of her own evolving truth. As time passed, she noticed that the most significant changes were not dramatic shifts, but subtle internal adjustments, moments when she paused before agreeing, before apologizing, before assuming responsibility for emotions that were not hers to carry. And in these pauses, she felt a growing sense of alignment between her thoughts and actions, realizing how rarely she had allowed herself this space in the past, because her life had been structured around anticipation rather than intention. Yet now, with greater awareness, she began choosing responses that reflected her actual capacity instead of inherited obligation. And although this felt uncomfortable at first, as if she were breaking an unspoken rule, the discomfort gradually gave way to relief because she was no longer betraying herself for the sake of maintaining harmony. And as she observed her interactions from this new perspective, she recognized how often silence had been mistaken for peace and compliance for love. Understanding that true connection did not require constant availability or emotional sacrifice, but clarity and presence. And while some people struggled to adapt to this version of her, she resisted the impulse to correct their perception, trusting that being understood was less important than being honest. And through this trust, she developed a deeper respect for her own boundaries, not as walls but as definitions, markers that allowed her to engage with others without losing herself. And as she continued practicing this way of being, she felt a growing steadiness, a quiet confidence rooted not in certainty or control, but in the knowledge that she could navigate complexity without abandoning her inner compass. And this realization reshaped her relationship with the future, transforming it from something she feared into something she felt capable of meeting with calm attentiveness, rather than urgency or doubt. There were moments when she still questioned herself, usually late at night or in the quiet spaces between obligations, wondering whether this new way of living was truly strength or simply another form of withdrawal. But each time doubt surfaced, she noticed that it no longer consumed her the way it once had, because she had learned to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it, understanding that not every question required an immediate answer. And in this patience, she discovered a deeper layer of self-trust, one that did not depend on reassurance from others or validation through outcomes. And as she reflected on her past patterns, she saw how often she had confused endurance with virtue, believing that staying silent or accommodating discomfort was evidence of maturity. Yet now she recognized that growth was not measured by how much one could tolerate, but by how honestly one could respond to what was happening inside. And this shift altered her sense of responsibility, freeing her from the illusion that she was obligated to carry emotional weight simply because she was capable of doing so. And while releasing this belief did not erase guilt entirely, it softened it enough to be manageable, allowing her to move forward without constant self-negotiation. And as she practiced acknowledging her needs without dramatizing them or minimizing their importance, she felt a gradual integration of past and present, as if different versions of herself were finally allowed to coexist without judgment. And this integration brought a quiet resilience, one that did not announce itself through bold declarations or visible change, but through consistency, through the steady alignment of intention and behavior. And with this alignment came a sense of groundedness that made her feel less reactive to external pressure, more rooted in her own experience, and increasingly confident that whatever unfolded next, she would meet it not from habit or fear, but from conscious choice. In the end, she understood that closure was not something granted by another person or delivered through a final conversation, but something that emerged slowly when she stopped abandoning herself in the hope of preserving harmony. And this realization did not arrive with relief or celebration, but with a calm heaviness that felt honest, because it required her to accept both what had happened and what would never be explained. And as she looked back on the years she had spent adjusting her truth to fit the comfort of others, she no longer felt anger or regret as sharply as before, only clarity, the kind that settles quietly and reshapes perspective without demanding attention. And with this clarity came a new definition of peace, not as the absence of conflict or pain, but as the ability to remain present without distortion, without self-betrayal, and without the constant need to justify her feelings. And while parts of her story would always carry unresolved edges, she recognized that incompleteness did not diminish its value, because meaning was not created by perfect understanding, but by honest acknowledgement. And as she stepped forward into the next phase of her life, she did so without urgency, no longer measuring progress by milestones or approval, but by alignment, by the simple question of whether she was acting in accordance with what she knew to be true. And in choosing this alignment again and again, she found something steadier than certainty and stronger than validation, a grounded sense of self that did not require explanation. And in that groundedness, she finally felt at home within her own life.